Okay, so welcome, and yeah, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whatever time of the day it is for you. You can also see that I am not the only person whose name is on the slide. I'm representing an author team. So I'd just like to acknowledge Jacqueline Mesbus, my colleague from the University of New South Wales in Sydney, and Rebecca Piekkari from Aalto University in Finland. So I'll be presenting some joint work that we've been doing in this webinar. So Ibret, next slide. So we said we'd be talking today about interpretive research, and this is interpretive research in the qualitative tradition. Now, when we talk about interpretive research, there are in fact many ways of doing interpretive research, but there are two that are perhaps dominant in management research in the period since the late 1980s, I guess we can say. And what we're trying to do in this paper is point out that they're quite different and they have quite far-reaching implications. So just on the left-hand side, we've got one particular tradition, and I'll be talking about it and contrasting it with another one. So the problem comes down to what really is good or rigorous interpretive research. And you can see that I've got scare quotes with rigorous, because quite a few interpretive researchers would actually be a bit uneasy talking about rigor. Maybe trustworthy interpretive research would, I think, be a phrase that they'd be more comfortable with. But anyway, I'll keep going with rigor. And we have used the phrase rigor and rigorous in our paper, simply because in a sense we want to we want to question how rigor is usually interpreted. So again, it all comes down to interpretation, how you are interpreting these core terms. So let's have a look at the left-hand side. So according to some, if you're an interpretivist, if you're going about research as an interpretive scholar, what you're trying to do is faithfully reproduce the lived experiences of your informants. And so in a sense, the role of the researcher is a bit like a glorified reporter. You transmit the meaning that is given to you. And then what you do is, following the interviews that you've done, you then reproduce what it is that you've been told in theoretical terms. Okay, so that's one sort of very lively approach that you'll see, and you can see it's the basis for a lot of the work appearing in management journals. Now, on the right-hand side, you have another interpretation of what rigorous research is, and that is that you're constantly questioning. You're constantly questioning what you're being told, what you think you're seeing, how you think you're understanding it, what sort of interpretations are being placed on the data that you've been collecting, etc., etc. So questioning and always questioning, and understanding that your own interpretations are always going to be limited. And not only that, but the interpretations of those you're interpreting are also going to be difficult to access. So these are both two traditions within interpretive scholarship. Now, what we argue in the paper is that the one on the left-hand side is the one that's currently dominant in management research. And in a way, that's a little surprising, because a lot of qualitative research is derived from the second tradition. So what we want to do is, I guess, highlight the value of the second tradition. So Ibrit, if you move to the next slide. So let's start putting a bit of flesh to the bones. So if we continue with the left-hand side, we identify that sort of faithful reproduction of informants' worlds and their accounts of these worlds, as we denote that as naturalist. We call that the naturalist interpretive tradition. And you might say, why do you do that? Because that's what they originally called themselves. So if you have a look at the origins of qualitative research methodology, it underwent quite a bit of a revival in the 1970s and 1980s. And there are names that you may have been reading or you may have heard of. So Norman Denzin, Lincoln and Guber, a couple of researchers, not actually management researchers, but they had a lot of influence on qualitative management research. And they denoted what they were doing as naturalist inquiry. Okay, so that's where we've got the term naturalist from. And once you start delving into naturalist inquiry, you can see that they've got a couple of main pillars, and I've listed for you there. And as I've already flagged, the notion is that you, as the researcher, have the obligation to faithfully reproduce their own representations of their worlds. And that's what you're trying to do. And what you then need to do is once you have faithfully recorded it, you process that, you generate categories in theoretical terms that best represent their meaning. And in order to show that that's what you've done, that there is this tight fit between what they've said and the theoretical conclusions you've derived, you need to make the process as transparent as possible to the reader. So you can see that that leads to a couple of assumptions. One is that it is quite unproblematic to transmit that meaning from your informants to yourself as the researcher, that along the way you can faithfully represent what it is that they mean, and that there is going to be this tight fit that you can demonstrate. So that's the naturalist side. And interestingly, Lincoln and Guber, who are perhaps the best known in management research from this tradition, they actually later distanced themselves from these assumptions and from the implications of it. But this was their earlier work, and there was a book on naturalist inquiry that they published in the mid-1980s. Okay, so that's the left-hand side. Now, then on the right-hand side is the tradition that in the paper we're very interested in, or traditions. And that's what you can loosely say is a hermeneutic tradition. And according to that tradition, which is a very old one, it goes a long way back and has been incredibly influential across a range of different qualitative approaches. And they really are very sensitive to the difficulties of interpretation, that it actually is not easy to access other people's meanings. And it's not even easy for ourselves to articulate and understand the social worlds that we operate in. So even as participants, we are always struggling to understand what's going on in the world around us. So we are really dependent on interpretations of interpretations. That's the sort of data that we work with as researchers. So our understanding of the social world is always mediated. It's never direct. And importantly, and this is something I'll come back to, importantly, we need the broader context to help us try to understand what it is that's going on. So this means that when we're analysing data, it's not just processing it, aggregating data into themes. What we're doing is constantly questioning, what does this actually mean? Do I really understand this? How does this change my view, etc., etc.? So you can see that even though both these traditions are looking at interpretations, they do so in a very different way. And on the left-hand side, our argument is that there are considerable dangers in going down this route. At worst, it can be tantamount to naive induction, that you just believe what you hear. Somebody says that, this is how it works for me and my company, and you just faithfully write it down and you treat it as being the truth. And it also potentially can lead to sort of a tidying up, an early tidying up of all of these questions, anomalies,
looks like
surprises, and different.
Catherine's.
Sorry? Sorry?
I think, Catherine, you're fine. Ibret might have just unmuted himself by accident for half.
Oh, okay. Okay. Oh, I think we might have lost Ibret. that might be the problem. Yeah.
Sorry
okay.
about that.
Okay, and I'll keep going. He's got my slides. There you are. Okay, it's going to just be one of those days, I think, Ibret. Okay, so the problems with the naturalist tradition are not only potentially that we don't question what we hear, but we then also need to be worried not just about demonstrating a tight fit between data and theory, but we need to constantly be questioning, okay, well, is this the best fit? Is this really the best way of understanding what people are telling me? And also, there is then the truth status of the data that you're obtaining and the interpretations that you are putting forward as your own. To what extent can we really be confident in our findings? In the interpretive tradition, there's a lot of doubt, a constant doubt all the way through, and an understanding that the interpretations that we end up with, our theoretical contribution, they also remain always provisional and always subject to revision. Okay, so in this sense, the doubt never stops. You end up with the best interpretation that you can, but it's always subject to critique and further evolution. Now, of course, the problem with that is often the rest of the scientific community sees that sort of hermeneutic understanding as being unscientific. Now, our argument is that actually no, that the hermeneutic tradition is a tradition that confronts head-on the subjectivity of the research process. So rather than hiding it, denying it, underplaying it, it actually grapples with it. And that in itself gives you greater confidence in findings. Okay, so they're the two traditions that we're working with in the paper. And as I said, our agenda is very much to put the hermeneutic tradition back in focus in management research, because we think that even though it's been very important to the evolution of qualitative research, also in management, that its influence has been a little muted in recent years. Okay, Ibret, if you're able to move on. Now, I think to crystallize the difference between these two traditions, it's quite useful to go back to concepts of first and second order. So these concepts of first and second order have been popularized in the so-called Gioia methodology, which I'm sure a lot of you listening in today are familiar with. So Gioia and his colleagues have been very successful in popularizing their idea of first and second order. So those of you who are familiar with the methodology, you'll know that what they advocate is that you generate first and second order codes of your data, and then you display it visually in a data structure. So that's one of the visual displays that you'd have in a paper. Now, we had a look at these terms, first and second order, and it turns out that Gioia and his co-authors obtained the concepts of first and second order from an earlier piece by John van Maanen. And so John van Maanen is going to be a scholar that whose name everyone knows. And John van Maanen was writing about first and second order concepts already in 1979. So if you're interested in looking at that paper, which I actually would recommend, you'll see the reference to it in our ORM paper. So we went back and we had a look at the Gioia concepts of first and second order, compared it to John van Maanen's, and actually they're quite different. So in the Gioia data structure, which we would argue is naturalist in its approach, when they talk about first order, they're talking about informant-derived categories. So these are categories from informants' talk, and you name the codes so that you're using terms that are quite close to the ones that your informants used. Okay, so that's first order. Second order are the abstract categories that you're grouping informant talk into. So that's the naturalist Gioia style version. Now, John van Maanen, however, when he was using the terms, and again, he was borrowing them too. So this is quite typical in a lot of academic work, of course. You have to dig deeper to find out where these terms originated from. And John van Maanen was borrowing the terms from the philosopher Alfred Schutz. And van Maanen stays quite close to the original meaning of the terms that Schutz proposed. And really what first and second order mean to both Schutz and van Maanen are referring to the different challenges of interpretation that you have as a researcher. So the first issue here is that when you're trying to understand what it is that informants are telling you, you're already putting your own interpretations upon it. So there is no sort of clean version of informants talk. You already have to interpret what it is that people are telling you. And so first order concepts are not independent of the researcher. So this is really where your interpretive work starts. So it's not as though there's this separate category of informants talk. You already are trying to interpret what you're being told. And not only that, but you being in the field and interacting with participants already is changing the encounter and is already influencing the sort of data that you're collecting. So there is no sort of independent raw data that is separate from you as the researcher. Okay, so you can see that when hermeneutic scholars are talking about first order, they're talking about a particular challenge of interpretation. They're not talking about a separate sort of data that exists untouched by the researcher. Okay, so that's first order in the hermeneutic tradition. And second order then is, yes, the researcher's ways of trying to understand participants' worlds. But again, a lot of skepticism and doubt needs to be practiced here. Why are you interpreting the data this way? Why are you using these theoretical categories? So again, you're not escaping the problems of interpretation. You've got just a different order of interpretive challenges. And that's really the point that hermeneutic scholars are making when they're talking about first and second order. So with first order, it is, okay, well, what are they saying to me? And the second order, the challenge is, well, how am I really going to understand it? How am I going to represent this theoretically? So that's what first and second order means in hermeneutic terms. So rather than seeing data as raw and pure and separate from the researcher, and the theory then emerges from the data through your processing of it and coding of it, you are actively constructing interpretations according to the hermeneutic tradition. So hopefully from this discussion, you can see the difference between the two. Okay, so Ibrit, I think we'll move forward, unless you think there are any questions at this point. Are people clear on the differences, or should I?
Catherine, there is an interesting question from Maria. She's asking, can you refer a recent qualitative study using the hermeneutic approach, perhaps your own work? I would perhaps kind of extend that question by asking, do you have an illustration of, for example, of the same text that's being interpreted differently by those two different traditions? That
would be great to do. So if anyone thinks of doing that, I would encourage it. So what you're suggesting is to take a data set and interpret it these two ways. Yeah. Look, to my knowledge, that hasn't been done, and I think would be worth doing. Now, we do have an illustration in the paper. So if you go to our paper, we've tried to illustrate the hermeneutic tradition and a more hermeneutic approach to analysing data. So I can refer you to that. But no, I am not aware of a paper that goes through and uses the same data and interprets it according to both traditions. That would be a great project to do. So if anyone is thinking of doing it, I'd say go for it. So Maria, give it a go.
Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else? Anything else at this point? So as long as people have got this distinction between the two traditions, I think we can potentially move on. Yeah. Okay. So as I said, that a lot of interpretive scholars are uneasy with the term rigor. And that is because it really reinforces this idea that somehow the main task with interpretation is to follow the right technical procedures. And quality is all about technique. So that's what in the paper we term procedural rigor. We do retain the term rigor, but we try to redefine it, to reinterpret it. And for us, rigor is all about the quality of your questioning. And that is the essence of the interpretive tradition, at least the hermeneutic version of it. Now, I've been talking about the challenges that you have because the hermeneutic version of first and second order are all about interpretive challenges. And in fact, we suggest there are 3 challenges of interpretation. The first one is, yes, working out what the heck we're really being told by participants. And the second one is dealing with your own interpretations and the way in which we all rush to conclusions. We all put our own meaning on the data, and very often we're not aware of it. We're rather blind to it. So how do we battle that, and how do we get around these initial impressions that often we end up imposing without us even realizing that that's what we're doing? But the third one then is to keep on pushing our interpretations, because very often what happens is that our theoretical conclusions do evolve or can evolve. And as we cycle through different possible explanations, we do find that we're seeing things differently as to when we started. So for us, this encapsulates the challenge of subjectivity that hermeneutic scholars are really alerting us to. And so this is what we're trying to offer in the paper. So we don't have a nice, neat little linear pathway, unfortunately, that we can offer people. But what we do offer is what we call heuristics, which are guides to thinking. So we're using the term heuristic not as shortcuts, but as ways to stimulate further questioning. And for us, these heuristics are the way in which we can ensure interpretive rigor. So what I'd like to do for the rest of the session is take us through these heuristics, which we think are really useful questions that we can pose during the research process, and which allow you to deepen your insights along the way. So the short answer to how do you get to interpretive rigor is, well, hopefully these heuristics can help. So, Imran? Okay, so we'll start with this issue about interpreting what it is that participants say to us. And for us, the overarching question here to keep asking ourselves is, what's really going on here? And this is a very classic question for qualitative researchers in the field. What the heck is going on? And again, if you look at Van Manen's work, he really warns you against believing what you're seeing or what you're hearing. So this is why doubt, skepticism, suspicion of interpretations is important. You never quite know what you're being told. And even if you're not deliberately being misled, participants may not be telling you the full story. They may not know the full story. And you may not be understanding it properly. And one of the big issues, of course, when it comes to meaning, is the context in which utterances are being made. As we all know, you can't understand the meaning of something just from looking at words on a page. You have to contextualize it. And this part-whole aspect of understanding is really central to the hermeneutic tradition, and it is central if we're going to understand what it is we're being told. So not only thinking about, okay, well, how have my own prejudices and assumptions imposed meanings on the data that may not even be there, or what might I be missing from my understanding of what people are telling me? It's also a question of standing back and saying, okay, well, what is this broader context in which participants are operating, and therefore potentially changes the understanding. So you can see that what is really going on here sounds simple, but when we start looking at the complexity of meaning, the complexity of human conversation and human action, it's actually way more complicated than what it first seems. So for those, I can only just see comments flashing through on the screen, but it seems that you're suggesting that, yes, it's all about depth of understanding rather than just breadth. And I'd agree with those points that you're making. So really, you can see why we're talking about destabilizing our initial interpretations, and really coming to an understanding of what's important in data is by no means an automatic process. So that's the first challenge, and you can see that it's a cycle. It's not as though that this happens and then you move on to the next challenge. These are concurrent challenges that you're facing in a qualitative project. So Ebrat, we'll move on to the next one. But of course, then you are going to be asking the next question, which is, okay, how do I make sense of this in theoretical terms? So what is this theoretically? So here you're trying to say, okay, well, how do we explain what's going on? And we liken this process to a series of thought trials. And again, this is not an easy process of going from one set of categories to another. We, in the paper, liken it more to a cycle where you're trying for better explanations. And the way to move forward here is to be constantly looking for a way to test your interpretations. So what doesn't fit? And you'll be looking in particular for data which is puzzling, which seems to be an outlier, and which perhaps initially you don't focus on. So what we're saying is that not all data are equally revelatory. And often it's the data that is difficult to categorize, that doesn't seem to conform to the majority view of what you're being told, that seems to be a misfit, that can actually lead you to new insight. So it's these disturbances, in a sense, the things that refuse to be neatly categorized, that often provide these aha moments. And they can often be quite difficult when you first strike them. You know, what the heck is somebody saying here? How can I deal with this? This doesn't nicely fit in with my model. So very often these moments where things are not fitting together are actually stepping stones towards an enhanced or understanding, and perhaps something that challenges your initial interpretations as well. So this is likely to be an unsettling process, particularly if you were starting to form a theoretical explanation for what's going on, and then suddenly you see that you're undermining this initial understanding that you started with. So these heuristic questions that we've come up with are really trying to help that process along the way. And it's a recognition that the process of data analysis and constructing theoretical models is never a smooth or easy one. So any questions here? Okay, so
Catherine, there are a couple of, I think, interesting questions
sure.
From Emilia and Adwoa. Adwoa and Emilia, do you want to pose the questions directly? I think they're really interesting questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, hi Catherine, thanks for the very interesting presentation. We were just in the chat wondering about the research process, as Avnoa and myself as well have noticed that perhaps in the beginning we first take the face value, since we are new to the context, and we we have to believe them because we cannot really question it. But then as our understanding increases, we are better able to sort of doubt and question and interpret. And then, at least for myself, I have noticed that I have moved, I keep moving between sort of more critical observations and then sort of going back to the neutral position, and it comes as sort of waves. So yeah. How do you see this process? Is that in line with your thinking, or? Yeah.
Particularly if you're coming in and you're not a native to the setting. So it also depends on what your relationship is with participants going in. If you're researching a setting that you're also a participant in, for example, if you're an insider or a native, as it were, there probably the challenge is a little different. But certainly if you're coming in as an outsider, and it's almost like you're learning a new language that you have to speak, there I agree with you. First of all, you are just having to accept what people are telling you. And so you'll be looking for clues. And all along the way, it's about looking for these clues that, well, hang on, things don't necessarily fit together in this nice, neat way, either in the way that it's being presented to me or in the way that I'm explaining it. And so I think that's actually a great encapsulation of the experience that you go through. And it is this reason that for this reason that in the hermeneutic tradition, and if you have a look at John van Maanen's paper, he really likens the researcher to a detective. In the naturalist tradition, the metaphor that's often used is a journalist, as in a glorified reporter, if you like. So researchers are glorified reporters. We write down what people tell us, and then we work out, what does this mean theoretically? In the hermeneutic tradition, it's not so easy. You are constantly trying to work out what really is the puzzle here, and then work out what is the solution to the puzzle. So I think what you're saying is that you started by trying to look for the puzzle, and then you try to solve it. Yeah. Yeah. So Ibrit, you said there was another question?
Yeah, there's several people kind of posing more or less the same question.
Yeah.
So Maricela, Tatiana, and Heiko, and Sadek, along the lines of how do we know when to stop challenging our assumptions or stop questioning our way of interpreting, and how do you justify it as well?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that is a great question. But we might move on to the third slide. So you're absolutely right. Then you have to draw this to a close. And as I said, our interpretations are always going to be provisional. They can always be overturned. But at some point we have to stop. And having said that, though, it does mean that we often do keep coming back to data. We keep coming back to research projects that we might have started many years ago, and we still see something new. So it doesn't mean that you can't publish along the way, but you may, in fact, have the opportunity to revisit sites, revisit data even, and you'll be surprised how your opinion has changed. There's a great piece, and now I can't give you the reference straight away, but there's a great piece by a sociologist, I think, who went back to her PhD data many years later, and she realized that she'd have a very different interpretation of the data set now, with her experience and with her, not just researcher experience, but life experience. She'd have a very different interpretation of the results. So in a sense, my answer is you never finish. Because there could always be another interpretation. But certainly the point at which you can be confident in offering your interpretation for an audience, whether it is an examiner or in the form of a journal article, is when you think that you can defend your interpretation, that at least there's nothing that you can find that contradicts the explanation that you've come up with, that you've cycled through perhaps the most obvious ones, that you have looked for alternative explanations and rejected them. And you've tested them. Now you've tested them on data, but you've also tested your interpretations to different audiences. And depending on the research setting, of course, that may involve the participants themselves, so that you've tested to see if they buy the storyline, even if it's not exactly what they told you, but they nevertheless say that, yes, this does capture, some essence of the world that we live in. And yes, you have provided us with an explanation of that world. And it may not be something that they agree with, but they may say that, yes, that's one way of looking at it. So these are all ways in which you can say to yourself, well, obviously somebody else coming in, or even me coming in at a later date, might have some other way of explaining what's happening. But this is certainly a plausible explanation, and one that hopefully is illuminating, not just for a researcher audience, but for the participants as well. So in a sense, there's no neat conclusion, but that is the point. The point is that we're constantly cycling through possible interpretations. And this is why also it's important to return to the field if you possibly can, because you'll find that things have shifted. Your own perspective might have changed, the perspectives of the informants might have changed, etc., etc. So you'll find in the hermeneutic tradition that trying to stay engaged with the field or return to the field is a really important part of the process. So I don't know if that's answered the question. It's probably not the nice, neat answer that you're possibly looking for. But it also then really does suggest that if you think about a research project, each paper is another way of extending your interpretations and extending your understanding of what it is that you're finding. Okay, Ibrit, are there any other questions you think that are relevant at this time?
Yeah, there are a number of other questions. Quite a few of them are long text. Maybe I could invite people to post questions directly to Catherine. I have a question, Catherine, if I may.
Sure.
Is there, if the interpretive approach relies so significantly on the interpreter, the researcher, is there a risk of us as interpreters bringing too much of our own kind of worldviews and values and preconceived views of things into this, which then shape how we interpret what people are saying or text analyzing? That's my first question. Maybe respond to the first question first.
Yeah. Well, I mean, basically what you're talking about is the human condition. That there is absolutely no way anyone can go into the field tabula rasa. And to claim that is really the essence of naive empiricism, that all we have to do is to go out, observe the world and report it. It would be great if that's what it was like, but it's not. We all come to the field with our own preconceptions, and part of this process, you can see, is working out what those preconceptions actually are and making sure that you do have opportunities during the process to question those and confront them and surface them, because the point about preconceptions is that we don't know that they're there. So part of the battle of field work is a battle with yourself and with a battle with your own perceptual screens, as we call it in the paper. And of course, the whole point about this is that you don't know that they're there. And it's really only through the process of analysis that you start to realize what your own assumptions actually were. And that's one of the signs that you're getting somewhere, that you are starting to come up against some of your preconceptions. And these moments are actually the ones that are most likely to be revelatory, because then you're starting to push boundaries beyond where researchers potentially have gone before. Remember that your starting point is going to be the starting point of the research community currently. And if you're going to offer something novel to the field, if you're going to offer something that's a little different, you do have to push beyond that. And that means that you do have to push beyond what everyone accepts as given. And that's an inherent part of this process. So you can see part of the struggle is against yourself. And that's a sign really that your analysis is really starting to get somewhere, that you are frustrated by your own original starting point and you're moving beyond it.
That sounds like it requires a high degree of reflexivity here on the researcher's part. Yes, it certainly does. But of course, you can see that it's also not just navel gazing, it's being active, and active questioning is really an important part of the process. But in our view, it's a part of the process which really has been downplayed
there's a lot of emphasis on the researcher as the faithful reporter or as the technician, whereas here it's, I guess, a bit of a personal struggle along the way as well, that you're pushing beyond, you know, the easy conclusions that might have readily been drawn at the start of a project.
And if I may, maybe one more question. Is there a potential challenge if the strong emphasis is on interpretation, then the research is being pushed into coming up with novel interpretations, which could mean that people just come up with novel, probably potentially wacky interpretations, even if it's may not be entirely true, but they can say, hey, it's my interpretation.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, in the end, that's any sort of research, as I said, because what I guess the interpretive tradition points to is the nature of the human condition. So it's not as though there's some research that's objective and there's other research that's just interpretive. All research is in interpretation. So it's just that I guess this tradition is really pointing to this nature of the research and of what we actually do. So yes, somebody I think in the chat said that there seems to be a strong affinity with the ethnographic tradition, and of course John van Maanen is an ethnographer, and certainly there are some affinities there, and ethnographers will talk about defamiliarization. That really what we're doing in the process of research is defamiliarizing the familiar. No, we think we know something. And really what research is about is realizing that we don't, but this is another way of looking at it. And that I think is an important aspect of the research process. So I guess it's another way of really thinking about science, but putting in the fact that we can never get around subjectivity, and really what we should be doing as qualitative researchers is confronting it. And confronting subjectivities head on is really what we're doing when we're analysing data and when we're interacting in the field. So Ibrit, the last slide that we have today is actually from Alfred Schutz. So as I said, Alfred Schutz was the one who came up with this notion of first and second order. And as I've been saying, first and second order originally was not about, well, this is informant talk versus abstract theoretical categories, because you can't separate the informant from the researcher when we're looking at interpretations and interpreted data. But Schutz's point is that to be as scientific as possible, you have to factor in subjectivity. And of course, we see that as a contradiction, that, oh, no, being scientific is all about being objective. But he said that if you don't take into account subjectivity, you know, the subjectivity of your informants, the meaning that they place on their actions, and if you don't think about how you are putting meaning on that, then all you're doing is creating a fiction and nothing else. So you, in order to avoid just creating another fiction, you have to factor in subjectivity, and that's what the analytical process is all about. So rather than running away from it, it's about confronting it. And you can see from our heuristic questions, that's not just a matter of accepting what people say. It really is this process of digging deeper and of constant questioning. So hopefully those two contrasts that I posed, two interpretive traditions that I sort of posed as sort of puzzles at the start. Hopefully they have now been explained a little bit more, and you can see the differences between these two traditions. So Ibrit, if you don't mind going back to the second slide. Hopefully when we come back to it, people can see how important these two traditions are and how distinct they are. So the first one, the naturalist approach, is, I would say, the dominant one in terms of thinking about data and data analysis at the moment in qualitative management research. But we hopefully today have had at least a glimpse into the potential of the hermeneutic tradition, which, as I said, is a very long and deep one, and one which was very influential in qualitative research for a very long time. But our argument has been a little bit sidelined in the discussion of data analysis, data quality, and what constitutes the rigor of management research. So that's a very quick run through what is a complex set of ideas and a complex tradition.
Thank you, Catherine. And I think we forgot to mention at the beginning that the session will run, or at least you'll be able to speak for an hour, and that hour came to an end now. But I wonder, because I think you also had other contributors to your paper, and whether they might be here in the Zoom call as well, and whether they would like to continue the conversation. If you have to go, Catherine, just checking.
Yeah, actually, I saw that Rebecca, are you still here? I saw that you were here.
Yeah.
I didn't realize you were going to be joining the call.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, I'm here. I've enjoyed very much the interaction. Lots of good questions, and I've tried to answer some of them. But I can stay for a little bit if there is something that hasn't yet been answered.
Thank you, Rebecca. Maybe we can open it up for Q&A, because I can see there are lots of questions in the chat, and it would be nice to continue the conversation if possible. And Rebecca has been already doing a great job fielding the questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and we can just continue the conversation. Yeah, Adwoa?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Catherine and Rebecca, for the presentation. I read your paper, and to be honest, I found it very interesting. And in the beginning, also a bit not confusing, but in this, like I mentioned in my comment before, that I realized that I love qualitative research, but I realized that in qualitative research, there seems to be different, should I say, families of approaches. And sometimes it's really difficult to put two and two together, or put the different approaches together. And it seems like you are kind of restricted to sticking to one approach. And I would like to know what you think about kind of mixing approaches, because I do know that it's encouraged that you take the approaches, or you kind of mix the tools based on what is relevant to your own project, or based on what works for your project. But at the same time, I could see how you could end up like in the middle of some kind of disagreement between different families of qualitative research. That's the first question. And the second question is also related to data collection. I wanted to find out if it's possible and how to kind of prove the rigor of your study if you have only one data collection method. So if you're doing just interviews and you can't kind of confirm with something else, or if you're using Eisenhardt's style of research, you would have to triangulate. But if you're doing just interviews and you can't triangulate, then how do you really prove that you went through a rigorous process just using interviews? Thank you.
I don't know, Rebecca, do you want to start or shall I?
Well, maybe I could just say, Adwa, that sort of combining the two, the naturalist and the hermeneutic, I think the essence of Catherine's presentation was very much that they draw on different assumptions about the researcher and the informant. So in that sense, mixing them it results in some contradictions, in my view. So we talk about, in a way, qualitative positivism and then these alternative traditions. As to doing an interview study rigorously, I think, for example, you can compare different interviewee groups. For example, you can compare perhaps former employees with current employees. You can include your own expectations, what you thought you would be finding versus what you actually found. So in terms of sort of questioning and analyzing the data deeply and analytically, you don't need to have multiple data sources, but you can engage in this kind of comparison and questioning.
And also, as we were saying, to really make use of your understanding of the broader context, because that's absolutely essential to understanding.
Okay, thank you very much.
Wen?
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. Also very insightful discussion in the chat function. So if I think we agree that sort of this kind of qualitative research is more like a co-production. So like researchers and our own subjectivity is also part of the element that we put into produce a theory that we're interested in. But then the issue is that different researchers, actually, they might actually get very different conclusions when they approach the same issue, even with the same set of data. And even though, you know, both might follow the interpretive rigor that you show with us. So then how do we decide, or how can the readers decide which one is like trustworthy? And so the issue of subjectivity, because I have experienced myself when I'm like working together with my co-authors, you oftentimes get very different kind of feeling of what is important. And both are, you know, make sense in this regard. How do we deal with this issue of subjectivity? Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, there can be multiple interpretations ultimately. So sometimes you can use that to an advantage. One solution is not to try to converge on a single explanation, but to have different explanations that could be in the same paper or in separate papers. But yeah, I mean, of course, in fact, having multiple interpretations within your own researcher team sounds wonderful, because this whole process of questioning is going to be automatically happening. So you can see that as being the main value add, that you all have different interpretations, and it's through your discussions about it that you're going to generate a lot of the insight. So I think that's it, but you can see that very often your breakthrough moments are moments of frustration as well. You know, so the aha moment is often an oh damn moment, because you know, you come across obstacles, difficulties, things that don't fit, people who don't agree.
And this is what Catherine is explaining is a very different view to this measure of inter-rater reliability, where sometimes you're asked to say, to what extent did you agree and read the data in the same way? So that's a different viewpoint to the co-author dynamics.
Sadek?
Hi, thank you, Ibrat. So my question is a little bit contextual, probably. So when I'm interviewing the extremely marginalized entrepreneurs, I feel like I'm probably not understanding what they're saying most of the time. It's like, because let's let me give you an example. Like I asked them about how satisfied are you with your life, and they said, oh, I'm satisfied, god has given me everything, and that's all. Like most of I asked the same question to, let's say I have done 5, 6 at least 3 in a day, and most of them come up with the same interpretation. So am I understanding something wrong, or is there some deep meaning which I am not understanding? How should I move forward? Like what kind of is there any criticality behind that which I'm not getting into?
Well, maybe your question is quite general. So if you start asking the people to share examples with you, for example, you might get richer and more nuanced answers. But also I think it's important to spend enough time in the field. So we tend to have these short stints, and we often go sort of with the initial impression and sort of rush to conclusions. And I think that it's important to let the interviewees prove that you were wrong, in a sense, and have that open mind. So probably if you start asking for examples, they might give you more different answers.
Yeah, and one part of being in the field is often, and part of understanding the context is trying to understand how you interact with people in the field. And it may be that you are asking the wrong question. Often we do ask the wrong questions because it might work in context you're familiar with, but it may not work in the context in which you're operating in the field. So understanding how to ask questions, or even, you know, should I ask questions, or just let them talk about their experiences and undertake a different type of interview. So yeah. Again, it's about always, and you are questioning your data. You know, you are asking questions, which is great. Yeah.
Thank you, Bertha.
Yeah, thank you for a very, very interesting discussion. It's very clear how you presented the hermeneutic tradition, and I'm very glad that we are coming back to it. I'm interested in the insider challenge with this interpretive rigor. I'd like to go more into it from the perspective of not being discouraged, but from really getting a serious discussion on what does that critical distance look like? Because the way it has occurred to me is, don't do research there because you're from that place, and so you're going to be caught up in the dynamics of the native, that kind of native discussion, and will be blinded and not see. When at the same time I want to understand. I'm beyond just journalistic reporting and all. I truly do want to understand. There's a problem here. I noticed it there. It's my context. It's my culture, perhaps. But there's a problem, and I want to explore it further. So this notion of the critical distance and the outsider, and here I'm doing a bit of a critique in terms of how we have taken on the whole ethnographic enterprise. It's always the outsider who understands me. I cannot understand my own setting and culture, and so I want to bring that out too. But at the same time, I do recognize that there is the problem of you may have a blind spot, or many blind spots, because of so many taken for granted things. So from my own experience, one thing I'm realizing is it can be very destabilizing if you open up to your own preconceptions. I think the first task for me was in my current project with the wars and violence, violent conflict in certain countries in the African continent, places I have also worked in, is to just say, what is it that I hold on to very strongly about them? Just put it on the paper, just write it out freely, and then find that it has been a very destabilizing time in terms of rethinking, reconsidering, and maybe that is the critical distance. I don't know, but I also have a good understanding of some of the dynamics of the context that an outsider does not. I have a grasp of things that an outsider does not. So I'd like a much more pushing into this insider challenge compared to the outsider challenge, in a way that we are not certifying the outsider's knowledge as more valid and the insider having a problem with understanding their context. I think that's where I'm coming with this insider challenge.
And I mean, I guess from the hermeneutic point of view, any standpoint is going to have its limitations, right? So it doesn't matter whether you're insider or outsider, that you'll always have these blind spots, as you said. You'll always have certain screens. So it's not about one or the other being better or worse. It's that understanding what your potential blind spots are and being able to move beyond them. And as you say, potentially being more reflexive yourself, or even having an outsider voice. Have somebody else who can be talking to you and asking questions, who isn't so embedded in the field, and sort of being the devil's advocate, if you like. Mm-hmm. There are different ways of doing it, but from the sounds of it, you're very sensitized to the issues that you're going to face as an insider, and I think that's the first start, the start to the whole process. So Rebecca.
Yeah, no, I think you expressed it well, and I think this issue of somehow familiarizing or defamiliarizing the familiar, I think is the challenge here, and how to do it. There's probably no easy way, but somehow through a dialogue with these externals and exposing your work to those who are not as close is one way.
But certainly in whatever you write, to be able to talk about this process and what you did to get beyond those taken for granted assumptions, that would be fantastic to include in your work.
So I'm seeing, even in this recording, the rigor part, you're really doing a lot of writing down your reflections. It's like keeping a journal trail, tracking the whole, the three challenges. And maybe for the insider, it will be a bit, there'll be some slight differences, but the idea is self-critique, auto-critique.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I have to just warn you that I have to leave, but Rebecca is able to stay. So I do have to thank her for stepping into the breach. But thank you for being such an active audience.
Thank you, Catherine. And thank you for staying with us, Rebecca. Gioia, I hope I pronounced it correctly. Don't think I can hear you.
You're correct. Please accept my apology. I can't put on my but I wanted to follow.
It's breaking up in Gioia. Maybe you can type it up in the chat function and we can figure it out.
Okay, sure. I'll type it then.
Tanya? Tanya, do you want to pose your question?
Sorry, are you speaking to me, Tanya? Hi, can I speak?
Yes, please.
Oh, hi. I'm phoning from Cape Town, South Africa. I hope you are all well, and thank you for such an insightful session. So I am on my way to actually just looking at all the data that I have. And Rebecca mentioned that you need to spend enough time in the field. And that is one of my questions. What is enough time in the field? I am looking at leaders in companies in South Africa. So I'm looking at doing about 20 interviews, and I'm doing a hermeneutic study. I'm using Heidegger's hermeneutic approach. So firstly, that is my question. What is enough time in the field? Is 20 interviews sufficient? And I'm also looking at recourse data analysis. And I understand that this is an interpretive and how we look at our data, but I'm actually entering into that phase. So I just want to know before I start, is it the right way I'm going? Because with hermeneutics, there's no specific guideline, and I'm trying to find my way to this whole process, and I'm having to grab onto the literature, and I'm hoping at the end of the day it's going to be okay. So I think that this is for Rebecca, because it's, in a way, I'm teaching myself. My supervisor is excellent, but I'm the one having to find my path in this process. So what is enough time in the field? Is 20 interviews enough? And just to get your feedback, if that's okay, Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Tanya. I think it is very difficult to say what's enough, and I think it depends on how well you know the context in advance.
Right.
Are you already familiar with it? And also perhaps another aspect is that I would be more inclined not to fix the number of interviews at the start, but rather to approach the issue so that you have a flexible design, and as you go along, you will know whether you need more information, more perhaps not interviews, but some other source of data, and that will be clearer once you understand the phenomenon better. But I think building in this flexibility is really important in a good, strong hermeneutic study, and seeing the research design as something that prepares you for the field work, but is still flexible enough so that you can confidently change it.
Okay, no, that's extremely helpful. Thank you so much. And then just my last question is, in my previous qualification with masters, I did an ethnographic study, and I had the member checking and people saying, okay, you know what, this is good, I agree. Where I'm busy with now is in companies and leaders in a very high position, and they don't have time. And I'm asking, is the experience in that one-time interview enough, or do I need to still get some backup to tell them that this information is what's a true reflection of what they've said? Because I've had the background of ethnography, autoethnography as a matter of fact, and I'm doing a hermeneutic study with CEOs of companies, and their time is exceptionally limited. So I'm finding, I've used this lady in the US. She's written a book about phenomenology, and but her study was placed in almost like a spiritual context in the church, where there was a follow-up on clarity and gaps. So that was, and hermeneutics is about depth, it's about understanding meaning. So for me, it was about one interview, 2 interviews. So that is what was throwing my mind crazy, and so I'm just thinking, I think I'm getting caught up in all these little things about how much is enough and that type of thing, and how do I back up what my decisions are.
I think that at the end of the day, it boils down not to the number of interviews, but to the quality of the discussions that you have had, As to this issue of member checking or validation, I remember reading that Van Manen wrote in some of his work that a good study is one where somebody gets mad.
Okay.
And I thought that was an interesting way of putting it. So instead of seeking confirmation, the fact that it creates a reaction, in his view, was something of a quality sign. So to busy executives, you need to think about a format, how to give back. And it may be a presentation, it may be a one-pager, an executive summary, for example, or a blog post, something that they can read in haste, and perhaps not really look for validation, but rather as an avenue for additional data collection.
Okay.
So that's another way of looking at that point of research. And again, their reading and sense making of your study, but it's again just one reading alongside your own.
Okay.
So not better or worse, but perhaps similar or different.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. Much
Pleasure.
appreciated. Thank you.
The question Gioia wanted to ask earlier, just read it out, Rebecca. How does one deal with conflicting participant views, specifically when I'm interviewing both ends? How do I determine which view to take is accurate? Also, how do I investigate these conflicting views without making participants feel I don't believe them? Thank you.
Again, another thoughtful question. And I think this question comes from the thinking that we triangulate and then we need to arrive at sort of one fact or converging view, as Catherine was speaking earlier, while in the hermeneutic tradition, you would rather aspire for a rich, a holistic understanding, and you would be quite comfortable with the fact that there may be tensions, disjunctures between data sources. So aspiring for plurality and multivocality is perhaps something that goes very well with the hermeneutic tradition, then rather than this idea that, you know, all the data sources, all the perspectives need to point to one and the same direction.
Thank you. And perhaps one final question for today, to be conscious of time. Shikha.
Hi, thank you. My question is more towards the role of theory and data interpretation. So in interpretive or qualitative research, we start with the phenomena, we go through, we conduct interviews, we spend some time in the field, we collect data, we form categories, we try to make sense of the data. Post that, when we are interpreting, what is the role of theory? So in the sense, when you see patterns in your data, do you go back to existing established theories that are used in your field, or how do you connect what you are seeing from your data, the patterns that you are noticing in your data, to theories? So if you could just elaborate or explain this bit. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think one of our messages is that most of us do not start from the data. We don't go into the field with a clean slate, with a clean mind, but rather we have already been socialized and exposed to a number of theories, both sort of layman theories, but also as PhD students and scholars do a lot of literature and academic work. So in that sense, when we say that we start from the data, we actually bring already lenses and models and concepts to that data set. I think the question I mostly ask my PhD students at this point, in order to help them to connect to the literature, is the question that Charles Reagan has asked. And it is as follows: what is your study a case of? And that means that you have to connect the particular with something broader and express it in theoretical terms. And once you are able to answer that question what is by study a case of, you engage in something called analytical generalization. So you move to the level of theories and concepts. And that's one, I think, very helpful question that I ask myself, I ask my students to answer. And that's how you start searching for suitable literature that will then explain what you're seeing in your data set.
So it's not necessary that we use the existing theories and we challenge or extend the existing theories in that particular field. So I'm working.
Yeah, so you may extend, you may refine, you may challenge, you may, the meeting of theory and data, the relationship between theory and data can be alignment, but it can also be a tension, depending on what you want to do. So you often look for theory and literature where the surprise is the largest, where you have sort of at least initially the biggest tension, where you can deliver surprise to your audience, if one could say so.
Thank you so much.